Episode 5: The Land That Was Given Away. The night settled slowly over Bangkok. A warm breeze drifted along the Chao Phraya River. The water reflected hundreds of tiny lights from homes, boats, and temples scattered along its banks. Somewhere in the distance, a flute played softly. Its melody floated across the dark water before fading into the night. The city seemed peaceful, almost timeless. Yet Edward Whitmore had begun to understand something important. Peaceful places often hide difficult memories. The calm river before him had witnessed centuries of triumph and tragedy. Kings had stood upon its shores. Merchants had sailed its waters. Foreign diplomats had arrived bearing promises, demands, and ambitions. And tonight, Kun Prasert would tell him about one of the most painful chapters in Siam's history. A chapter that many people misunderstood. A chapter that revealed the true cost of survival. The old storyteller sat quietly beneath the pavilion lantern. For several moments, he simply watched the river, as though gathering thoughts from the darkness itself. Finally, he spoke. Many people imagine that history is a story of victories. Edward nodded. That was certainly how history was often presented. Battles won, territories gained, enemies defeated, heroes celebrated. The storyteller smiled faintly. But survival stories are different. He lifted his teacup. Sometimes survival requires sacrifice. The word hung in the air, heavy, uncomfortable, honest. Edward waited. He sensed that tonight's story would be more difficult than the previous ones. King Chulalongkorn worked tirelessly to strengthen Siam. Kun Prasert began. He modernized the government. He expanded education. He improved administration. He prepared the kingdom for a dangerous world. The old man paused, but preparation does not eliminate danger. The river flowed silently beside them. A small boat passed beneath the moonlight. Its lone lantern flickered gently. The storyteller watched it disappear into the darkness. Then he continued. By the late 19th century, France had become increasingly interested in territories east of Siam. Edward immediately understood. The regions that today include Laos and Cambodia, areas connected to Siam through complex historical relationships stretching back centuries. To modernize, maps often appear fixed, clear, permanent. But in the 19th century, many borders throughout Southeast Asia were less precisely defined. Influence overlapped. Authority varied. Local rulers maintained different relationships with larger kingdoms. The situation was complicated, and powerful empires often took advantage of complexity. French officials argued that territories east of the Mekong River should fall under French influence. Siam disagreed. Diplomatic tensions increased. Negotiations became more difficult. And gradually, the situation approached crisis. Edward listened carefully. He knew enough history to recognize the pattern. Disputes over borders, competing claims, escalating tensions. Such situations often ended badly for smaller nations. The storyteller nodded. As pressure increased, both sides became more determined. Then his expression darkened slightly, and eventually warships appeared. The words felt cold despite the warm night air. Warships, the unmistakable language of power. The unmistakable reminder that diplomacy sometimes operates under the shadow of force. Kun Prasert pointed toward the river. Imagine, he said, that you are standing in a small house. Outside, a giant arrives. The giant demands something valuable. You know you cannot defeat him in a fight. What do? Edward frowned. The question was uncomfortable, because there was no perfect answer. Fight and risk destruction. Submit and lose something precious. Neither option seemed acceptable. The storyteller nodded. That is the kind of decision Siam faced. The crisis reached a dangerous peak in 1893, a year still remembered in Thai history. French warships sailed toward Bangkok. The situation became extremely tense. The possibility of conflict felt real, very real. For ordinary people living in Siam, the future suddenly seemed uncertain. No one knew exactly what would happen. No one knew whether negotiations would succeed. No one knew whether the kingdom's independence could survive. The atmosphere was filled with anxiety, fear, and difficult choices. Edward could almost imagine the scene. Families whispering about rumors, officials rushing between meetings, diplomats sending urgent messages, soldiers preparing for possibilities they hoped would never arrive. History often felt inevitable when viewed from a distance, but for those living through it, nothing was certain. Everything hung in the balance. The storyteller's voice softened. King Chulalongkorn faced one of the most painful decisions of his life. The king understood something many people did not. A military confrontation with a major European power could be disastrous. Even if Siam fought bravely, even if individual battles were won, the long-term consequences could be devastating. The kingdom's reforms were still ongoing. Its modernization remained incomplete. Its military strength could not match that of Europe's great powers. This reality was difficult, but ignoring reality would not change it. And great leaders, the storyteller explained, must sometimes confront painful truths. Eventually, Siam agreed to territorial concessions. Large areas east of the Mekong River were surrendered, territories that are now part of Laos, land that had long been connected to Siam's sphere of influence, land filled with communities, histories, and memories, land that could not simply be replaced. The loss was deeply painful. Many people felt anger, others felt sadness. Some believed the kingdom had been humiliated. The emotions were understandable. No nation wishes to lose territory. No ruler wishes to sign such agreements. Yet the king believed he was protecting something even larger, the survival of Siam itself. The night seemed quieter now. Even the river appeared calmer. Edward stared at the pages of his notebook. This part of the story challenged simple ideas about heroism. There was no dramatic battlefield victory, no triumphant celebration. Instead, there was compromise, sacrifice, and a painful calculation. Lose part of the kingdom, or risk losing all of it. The storyteller seemed to sense his thoughts. History often judges these decisions harshly. Edward looked up. "Do you think the king made the right choice?" Kun Prosser smiled sadly. "That question has been debated for more than a century." The old man gazed across the water, and perhaps it always will be. For a while, neither spoke. The river continued flowing toward the sea. Lantern light shimmered on the surface. Somewhere far away, a dog barked briefly before silence returned. Finally, the storyteller continued. The territorial losses did not end in 1893. Edward frowned. There were more? There were. The old man nodded. Additional negotiations followed in later years. Further concessions occurred. Territories connected to modern Cambodia, parts of the Malay Peninsula, other regions. One by one, pieces of the old map changed. Each loss painful, each compromise controversial, each decision made under pressure. And yet, through it all, the kingdom itself remained independent. Edward slowly began to understand why this chapter mattered so much. Many outsiders looked at the modern map and assumed Siam had simply escaped colonialism through clever diplomacy. But the reality was more complicated. The kingdom had paid a price, a significant price. Its leaders had made sacrifices that remained emotionally difficult even generations later. Independence had not been free. It had required painful choices, and those choices continue to shape historical memory. Kun Praser reached for the teapot. Only a small amount remained. He poured the final cups. Steam curled upward into the warm night air. When people ask why Thailand was never colonized, he paused. They often imagine a perfect success. Edward nodded slowly. But history was rarely perfect. The storyteller smiled. Siam survived. Yes, but survival came with scars. The sentence lingered between them. Simple, yet deeply true. Every nation carries scars from its past. Some visible, some hidden, some remembered openly, others quietly. The story of Siam's independence included both pride and pain, victory and sacrifice, wisdom and loss. And perhaps that complexity made it more human. The old man looked toward the moon. Its reflection stretched across the river like a silver path. Sometimes, he said softly, the greatest courage is not charging into battle. Edward listened carefully. Sometimes the greatest courage is accepting criticism in order to protect the future. The words settled deeply. King Chulalongkorn had known that many people would disagree with his decisions. He knew some would call them weakness, others would call them surrender. Yet he carried the responsibility of protecting an entire nation, not merely its pride, not merely its reputation, its future. That burden was enormous, perhaps impossible for most people to fully understand. The breeze strengthened slightly. Palm leaves rustled nearby. The lantern above them swayed gently. And for a moment, the storyteller seemed lost in thought, perhaps remembering stories told by earlier generations, perhaps imagining the difficult meetings that shaped the nation's destiny. Eventually, he spoke again. But the story is not finished. Edward smiled. It never was. The deeper he traveled into history, the more connections he discovered, the more layers revealed themselves, the more remarkable Siam's survival appeared. Kun Prasert nodded. There is another reason the kingdom survived. What reason? The old man's eyes reflected the lantern light. The rivalry. Edward frowned. Between Britain and France? Exactly. The storyteller smiled. The two giants did not entirely trust each other. And that rivalry, surprisingly enough, would become one of Siam's greatest advantages. The lesson had reached its end for the evening. The city slept quietly beyond the river. The moon climbed higher overhead. And Edward closed his notebook with a deeper understanding than before. The kingdom's independence had not been secured through military victories alone, nor through luck, nor through geography. It had required sacrifice, painful sacrifice. The willingness to give up territory in order to preserve sovereignty. The willingness to endure criticism in order to protect future generations. The willingness to choose survival over pride. As he walked back through the sleeping city, he thought about maps. How people often see borders as permanent, yet history reveals how fragile maps can be, how quickly they change, how much human emotion becomes attached to lines drawn across land. And he thought about the king, a ruler carrying responsibilities so immense that every decision affected millions. A ruler forced to choose between bad options and worse ones. A ruler determined that Siam would remain free. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the moonlight dancing upon the Chao Phraya River. Imagine diplomats studying maps beneath flickering lamps. Imagine a king staring at those maps late into the night, knowing that whatever choice he makes, someone will suffer. Knowing that leadership sometimes means carrying burdens no one else can carry. And imagine a small kingdom standing between great empires, bruised, tested, changed, yet still standing. Because tomorrow night, we will discover how the rivalry between Britain and France unexpectedly became one of Siam's strongest shields, and how a small nation learned to survive between giants. Episode 6. The Great Game Between Britain and France. The river was unusually still that evening, not completely motionless. No river ever is, but calm enough that the lanterns along the banks reflected almost perfectly upon the dark water. Above Bangkok, the stars appeared one by one, small points of light emerging in the tropical sky. The city seemed quieter than usual, as though it too wished to listen. Edward Whitmore walked slowly toward the familiar pavilion. The air carried the scent of night-blooming flowers. A gentle breeze drifted through the trees. And somewhere nearby, a temple bell sounded once. Then silence returned. For several days now, Edward had listened to stories that challenged everything he thought he knew about Siam. He had learned about kings who studied astronomy, about reforms that transformed a nation, about painful sacrifices made to preserve independence, and yet one mystery remained. If Siam stood between two powerful empires, why had neither empire eventually absorbed it completely? Tonight, Kun Prasert promised to explain, and as Edward approached the pavilion, he found the old storyteller already waiting. Tea steamed gently in the lantern light. The river moved quietly beyond, and the night felt perfectly suited for history. Good evening, Edward. Good evening. The storyteller smiled. You have been patient. Edward laughed softly. I've learned that history rarely reveals its secrets quickly. Kun Prasert nodded approvingly. A wise observation. They sat together, listening for a moment to the sounds of water against wooden pilings. Then the old man began. "Imagine," he said, "that two tigers enter a forest." Edward listened carefully. The storyteller often spoke through images and metaphors, and somehow they always made complicated ideas easier to understand. The first tiger is powerful. The second tiger is equally powerful. They both want territory. They both want influence. They both want security. The old man paused. "What happens?" "They compete." "Exactly." Kun Prosser smiled. "They watch each other. They calculate. They worry. They negotiate. And sometimes they become so focused on each other that they overlook other possibilities." The lantern flame flickered gently. The river reflected moonlight, and the storyteller continued. By the late 19th century, Britain and France had become the dominant colonial powers in mainland Southeast Asia. Britain controlled Burma to the west. France controlled large territories to the east. Both empires possessed enormous resources. Both maintained powerful militaries. Both sought to protect their interests, and both viewed the actions of the other with caution, sometimes suspicion, sometimes outright concern. Neither wanted its rival to become too strong. Edward nodded. That part made sense. Great powers rarely trust one another completely, even when they cooperate, even when they avoid conflict. Competition often remains beneath the surface. The storyteller seemed pleased. "Exactly." He lifted his teacup. If France gained complete control of Siam, he paused. Britain would suddenly find French territory much closer to its own interests. Edward understood immediately. British officials would not welcome such a development. Not at all. The old man continued. And if Britain gained complete control of Siam, France would feel the same. The young traveler smiled. Now the picture was becoming clearer. Each empire worried about expansion by the other. Each empire preferred balance, and that balance created opportunities for Siam. But opportunities alone are never enough. The storyteller emphasized this carefully. Many nations throughout history occupied important strategic positions, yet they still disappeared. Geography creates possibilities. People determine outcomes. And this is where Siam's diplomats entered the story. Kun Prosser leaned back. The kings of Siam understood something important. What? They did not need Britain and France to become friends. Edward waited. They only needed to prevent either side from believing complete control of Siam was worth the risk. The simplicity of the statement surprised him, and yet the more he considered it, the more brilliant it seemed. The goal was not domination. The goal was balance, not victory. Stability, not confrontation. Careful navigation. The old storyteller pointed toward the river. A small boat drifted between two much larger vessels anchored nearby. "Look." Edward followed his gaze. The contrast was striking. The little boat moved quietly through the space between giants. Neither ship paid much attention. Neither felt threatened. Neither felt challenged. The boat simply continued its journey. "That," said Kun Prasert, "is often how survival works." Throughout the late 19th century, Siam engaged in constant diplomacy. Meetings, negotiations, treaties, conversations, letters, agreements. The work never truly stopped. Foreign ministers traveled. Envoys carried messages. Officials studied developments across the region. Every decision required careful consideration. Every word mattered. The margin for error remained small, very small. Edward imagined diplomats sitting late into the night. Maps spread across wooden tables. Reports arriving from distant provinces. News from Europe taking weeks or months to arrive. Every piece of information carrying potential consequences. History books often focused on dramatic moments, battles, wars, crises. But here, the kingdom's survival seemed tied to quieter things. Conversations, relationships, judgment, patience. The storyteller nodded. Most people underestimate diplomacy. His voice was calm. They imagine it is simply talking. But talking can prevent wars. Talking can buy time. Talking can create opportunities. Talking can save nations. The river flowed gently beside them. The words settled naturally into the evening air. One of Siam's greatest advantages was that its leaders understood the importance of learning from the outside world. The reforms begun under King Mongkut continued under King Chulalongkorn. Foreign advisors were sometimes invited to assist with modernization, not because Siam wished to surrender control, but because knowledge could strengthen independence. The distinction mattered very much. The kingdom borrowed ideas, not sovereignty. It adopted useful practices, not foreign rule, and that flexibility proved valuable. Kun Prosser smiled. You know what many outsiders expected? Edward shook his head. They expected Siam to resist every foreign influence. The storyteller laughed softly. And when that did not happen, they became confused. The old man lifted a finger. There is a difference between learning and surrendering. Edward immediately wrote the sentence down, because it felt important. Perhaps one of the most important lessons in the entire story. The lantern above them swayed gently. A breeze moved across the river, and the storyteller continued. Siam learned from many places: Europe, America, neighboring Asian societies. The kingdom observed, adapted, selected what was useful, rejected what was not. This approach required confidence. A nation uncertain of itself often fears outside ideas. A nation secure in its identity can evaluate them calmly, and that confidence helped Siam navigate a rapidly changing world. For a time, neither man spoke. The sounds of the river filled the silence, water moving against wood, distant voices drifting from passing boats, the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Eventually, Edward asked a question. Was independence ever guaranteed? Kun Prosser's answer came immediately. No. The single word carried tremendous weight. No, not guaranteed, not inevitable, not certain. The old man looked toward the stars. There were moments when the future appeared very uncertain. Edward remembered the previous chapter: French warships, territorial concessions, diplomatic crises. The kingdom had survived, but survival had never been assured. History often looks obvious when viewed backward, the storyteller said, but people living through it do not know the ending. Edward nodded slowly. That was true. Perhaps one of the most important truths about history. We know what happened. They did not. Every decision carried uncertainty. Every choice involved risk. Every compromise contained unknown consequences. The leaders of Siam were not following a script. They were navigating a storm. The moon climbed higher. Its reflection stretched across the river like a pathway of silver, and the storyteller's voice became softer, more reflective. You know, many people ask why Thailand was never colonized. Edward smiled, the question that started everything. Yes, Kun Prosser nodded, but perhaps there is another way to ask it. What way? The old man looked toward the dark water. How many things had to go right? The question lingered, because the answer was enormous. Wise kings, successful reforms, effective diplomacy, strategic geography, British concerns, French concerns, modernization, adaptation, timing, luck. All of it mattered. Remove one piece, and perhaps the outcome changes. Remove several, and perhaps the story ends very differently. The realization settled over Edward gradually. There was no single reason Siam remained independent. No magic explanation. No simple answer. Instead, survival emerged from countless decisions made across decades. Decisions by rulers, diplomats, officials, teachers, monks, merchants, ordinary people. History was rarely the work of one individual. It was a river fed by many streams. Kun Prosser smiled. You are beginning to understand the shape of the story. Edward returned the smile. I think so. Good. The old storyteller stood slowly. The lesson was nearing its conclusion, but not the story, because one of the most dramatic chapters still remained. The chapter many historians consider the greatest test of Siam's independence. The moment when the kingdom came closest to disaster. The moment when everything seemed uncertain. The moment when survival hung by a thread. The old man gazed toward the distant lights of Bangkok, and when he spoke again, his voice carried unusual gravity. There was a night, Edward listened, a night when foreign warships approached. A night when people feared the worst. A night when the future of the kingdom seemed to balance upon a knife's edge. The storyteller paused. The river flowed quietly beside them. The lantern flickered. The stars shone overhead. And for a moment, it felt as though history itself were holding its breath. "Tomorrow night," Kun Prasert said softly, "I will tell you about that night." The lesson ended. Edward closed his notebook, yet he remained seated for several moments, listening to the river, thinking about everything he had learned. The survival of Siam was not a miracle, nor was it an accident. It was the result of wisdom, adaptation, sacrifice, diplomacy, and perseverance. A delicate balancing act performed in one of the most dangerous political environments of the 19th century. And still, the greatest test lay ahead. As Edward finally rose and began walking back through the sleeping city, the moonlight followed him along the riverbank. The water shimmered, the breeze carried the scent of flowers, and somewhere in the darkness, the next chapter waited. A chapter of tension, of uncertainty, of courage, and of a kingdom standing at the edge of history. So tonight, as sleep slowly approaches, imagine the quiet river beneath the stars. Imagine two great empires watching one another across a map. Imagine diplomats studying documents by lantern light. Imagine a small nation moving carefully between giants. And remember that sometimes survival is not about strength alone. Sometimes it is about balance, patience, wisdom, and the ability to see opportunities where others see only danger. Sleep peacefully. The river still flows. The lanterns still glow. And the most dramatic chapter of Siam's survival story is about to begin. Episode 7, The Night Siam Almost Lost Everything. The night sky above Bangkok was clear. Thousands of stars shimmered softly overhead. The Chao Phraya River reflected their light in gentle waves that moved slowly toward the sea. A warm breeze drifted through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a boatman sang quietly as he guided his vessel through the darkness. The city seemed peaceful, peaceful enough that it was difficult to imagine fear ever living here. Difficult to imagine uncertainty. Difficult to imagine a moment when people wondered whether their country would survive. Yet, that was exactly the story waiting to be told. Edward Whitmore arrived at the Riverside Pavilion carrying more than a notebook. He carried anticipation. For days, Kun Prasert had been guiding him deeper into the history of Siam. Every chapter seemed to reveal another layer, another challenge, another difficult decision. And now they have finally reached the moment the storyteller called the kingdom's greatest test. The night when everything hung in the balance. The night when Siam stood face to face with empire. The old storyteller sat quietly beneath the lantern. His silver hair caught the warm glow of the flame. His eyes reflected the river. And tonight, before speaking, he remained silent for longer than usual, as though paying respect to the memories about to be shared. Finally, he began. "There are moments in history," Kun Prasert said softly, "when the future becomes uncertain." Edward nodded. The old man continued. "Most days pass quietly. People work. They eat. They sleep. They worry about ordinary things." Then he looked toward the dark water. But occasionally a single day arrives that changes everything. The river moved gently beneath the moonlight. The storyteller's voice lowered. And in 1893, one of those days arrived. To understand that moment, one must remember the world surrounding Siam. France had already expanded across much of Indochina. Its influence stretched through territories that today include Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. French officials believed their empire should continue growing. Siam disagreed. Disputes over territory had become increasingly tense. Negotiations dragged on. Accusations circulated. Trust weakened. And eventually, diplomacy alone no longer seemed enough. The situation grew dangerous. Very dangerous. Edward listened carefully. The story felt different tonight. Less reflective. More urgent. The storyteller nodded. Imagine a storm approaching. You can see dark clouds in the distance. You hear distant thunder. You know something is coming, but you do not know exactly when it will arrive. That was the atmosphere inside Siam. Officials followed every development closely. Messages traveled between ministries. Diplomats exchanged communications. Military leaders assessed possibilities. The king watched carefully. No one knew what would happen next. Yet, everyone understood that the stakes were enormous. Then came the warships. French warships, powerful vessels equipped with modern weapons. They approached the mouth of the Chao Phraya River. Their presence carried a message that required no translation. Power, pressure, determination. The kind of message empires often delivered when negotiations stalled. The kind of message smaller nations rarely welcomed. Khoon Prasert pointed toward the river beside them. Today, it feels peaceful. Edward nodded. It does. The storyteller smiled sadly. But imagine gunboats moving through these waters. The image was unsettling. The same river that now reflected lantern light. The same river where merchants traveled. The same river where children played along the banks. Transformed into a stage for international confrontation. History has a way of changing familiar places. As French vessels moved toward Bangkok, tension spread throughout the kingdom. Rumors circulated rapidly. People gathered information wherever they could find it. Families discussed uncertain futures. Government officials worked long hours. The atmosphere became heavy. Not panic, not yet, but anxiety, the uncomfortable awareness that events might soon move beyond anyone's control. Edward imagined ordinary citizens looking toward the river, watching unfamiliar ships approach, wondering what they meant, wondering what would happen next. History often focuses on leaders, kings, generals, diplomats. But beneath every historical event live millions of ordinary people. People who simply wish to continue their lives in peace. People who often bear the consequences of decisions made far above them. The storyteller seemed to sense this thought. History is never experienced by governments alone. He said quietly, it is experienced by families. The words lingered. Simple, yet powerful. The crisis intensified when French warships attempted to pass defensive positions near the river. Siamese forces tried to stop them. Shots were exchanged. The confrontation was brief, but significant. A line had been crossed. The situation now carried the possibility of something much larger. The possibility of war. Khoon Prasert paused. The lantern flame danced gently. The river flowed. And for several moments, only silence existed between them. Then the storyteller continued. Imagine being King Chulalongkorn that night. Edward looked up. The old man rarely asked direct questions. This one felt important. You have spent years reforming your country. You have modernized institutions. You have negotiated carefully. You have sacrificed territory to avoid disaster. And now, foreign warships stand near your capital. The storyteller's voice softened. What do you do? Edward didn't answer immediately, because there was no easy answer, only difficult ones. The king faced enormous pressure. Pressure from foreign governments, pressure from advisors, pressure from public opinion, pressure from history itself. Every decision carried consequences. Fight and risk catastrophe. Yield and face criticism. Negotiate and hope for a solution. No path guaranteed success. No path guaranteed safety. Leadership, Edward realized, often means choosing among imperfect options, especially during crises. The old storyteller nodded slowly. Many people imagine great leaders always know exactly what to do. A faint smile appeared on his face. But real leadership is often far more complicated. The river reflected moonlight. The stars remained bright overhead. And the story continued. Throughout the crisis, King Chulalongkorn worked tirelessly to preserve what mattered most, the survival of the kingdom. Not merely its territory, not merely its pride, its future. The distinction mattered, very much. The king understood something that history repeatedly demonstrates. Territory can sometimes be regained. Prestige can recover, but once a nation loses its sovereignty, recovering it becomes far more difficult. The stakes extended beyond the present moment. They reached into generations yet unborn. Eventually, agreements were reached. Painful agreements. Difficult agreements. The kingdom accepted territorial losses. French demands were partially satisfied. The immediate crisis eased. The warships no longer threatened the capital. The danger receded. Not completely, but enough. Siam remained independent. Wounded, pressured, changed, yet independent. Edward stared at his notebook. For a moment, he did not write. He simply thought, because this chapter challenged many popular ideas about history, there had been no dramatic battlefield victory, no glorious military triumph, no final scene in which the hero defeated overwhelming odds. Instead, survival emerged through restraint, judgment, compromise, and a willingness to focus on long-term outcomes rather than immediate emotions. The storyteller smiled. "You look disappointed." Edward laughed softly. "A little." Kun Prasert nodded. "Many people are." The old man gazed across the river. "We are taught to admire dramatic victories. History books love heroes charging into battle." Edward smiled. That was true. But sometimes, the storyteller continued, the greatest victory is preventing a disaster no one will ever fully see. The sentence hung in the air. Profound. Uncomfortable. True. The night deepened. A cloud drifted across the moon. The river darkened briefly. Then the silver light returned. The storyteller's voice became almost reflective. Imagine another version of history. Edward listened. A version where pride wins. A version where compromise becomes impossible. A version where war expands. The old man shook his head gently. "We cannot know exactly what would have happened, but we know the risks were enormous. The implication required no explanation. Some choices preserve possibilities, others destroy them. King Chulalongkorn chose preservation. For a while, neither man spoke. The sounds of the city drifted faintly through the darkness. A distant bell, a passing boat, the rustle of leaves. Eventually, Edward asked the question that had been forming in his mind. Was that the closest Siam came to losing its independence? Kun Prasert considered, then nodded. Perhaps. The answer was careful, measured, historically honest. Because history rarely provides perfect certainty, but few moments carry greater danger than the crisis of 1893. Few moments tested the kingdom more severely. Few moments revealed so clearly how fragile independence could be. The storyteller leaned back. His eyes followed the current. Yet, the remarkable thing is this. Edward waited. After the crisis, Siam did not stop changing. The old man smiled. It continued modernizing. It continued adapting. It continued preparing for the future. That resilience mattered. The kingdom refused to define itself solely through crisis. Instead, it kept moving forward, learning, improving, building, preparing for challenges still unseen. The lantern burned lower now. The evening lesson was drawing toward its conclusion. But Edward sensed something important. The story itself was nearing its final chapters. The major pieces were beginning to fit together. Wise rulers, modernization, diplomacy, sacrifice, geography, timing, all interconnected, all contributing to the same outcome, the survival of Siam. Kun Prasert stood slowly. The river continued flowing beneath the stars. And before ending the evening, he spoke one final thought. People often ask whether Siam was lucky. Edward smiled. Was it? The old storyteller laughed quietly. A little, then his expression softened. But luck alone never explains a century of survival. The answer felt exactly right. As Edward walked back through the sleeping streets of Bangkok, he found himself imagining that distant night in 1893. The tension, the uncertainty, the warships, the difficult decisions, the fragile hope that somehow the kingdom might endure. And it had endured, not because survival was guaranteed, but because generations of people had worked tirelessly to make survival possible. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, imagine moonlight upon the Chao Phraya River. Imagine distant ships moving through the darkness. Imagine a king standing awake long after midnight, carrying the weight of an entire nation upon his shoulders. And imagine the quiet courage required to choose the future over pride. The river still flows. The stars still shine. And tomorrow night, we will discover what happened after the crisis and how Siam finally emerged into the 20th century as the only independent nation in mainland Southeast Asia. Episode 8. The Dawn of a New Century. The river carried the first hints of dawn. Not yet sunlight, not yet morning, only that quiet, mysterious moment when night begins to loosen its hold upon the world. The stars still lingered overhead. The city remained mostly asleep, and the Chao Phraya River flowed onward as it had for centuries. Edward Whitmore arrived at the pavilion earlier than usual. For many nights now, he had listened to the story of Siam's survival. What began as a simple question had become something much deeper. He had learned about kings who studied foreign languages and astronomy. He had learned about reforms that transformed a kingdom. He had learned about territorial sacrifices, diplomatic balancing acts, and moments when independence seemed dangerously fragile. And now, he sensed that the journey was approaching its conclusion. Not the end of Siam's story. No nation's story ever truly ends. But the end of the question that had brought him here. Why was Thailand never colonized? The old storyteller was already waiting. Kun Prasert sat quietly beside the river, watching the horizon brighten. The silver in his hair seemed almost luminous beneath the fading starlight. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence felt appropriate. The kind of silence that belongs at the end of a long journey. Finally, the storyteller smiled. "Good morning, Edward. Good morning." Tea was poured, birds began singing somewhere in the trees, and the final chapter began. When people study history, Kun Prasert said softly, they often focus on moments of danger. Edward nodded. That seemed natural. Wars, crises, conflicts. Such events captured attention. They created drama. They filled books. The old man smiled. But survival is only the beginning. The river glowed faintly as dawn approached. What matters is what comes afterward. The crisis of 1893 had passed. Siam remained independent. The kingdom had lost territory. It had endured immense pressure. It had made painful compromises. Yet it had survived. And remarkably, it continued moving forward. The reforms begun by King Mongkut and expanded by King Chulalongkorn did not stop. If anything, they accelerated. The kingdom understood that survival required constant effort. The world was still changing, and Siam intended to change with it. New railways stretched across the landscape, connecting regions that had once felt distant. Travel became faster. Communication improved. Ideas moved more freely. Trade expanded. Government administration became increasingly efficient. Education continued growing. New schools appeared. More citizens gained access to knowledge. The foundations of a modern state became stronger with each passing year. Edward imagined the transformation. The kingdom his ancestors might have considered distant and mysterious was becoming increasingly connected to the wider world, not abandoning its traditions, not losing its identity, but evolving, adapting. The storyteller nodded. That balance mattered. He pointed toward a nearby temple visible beyond the river. Its golden roof caught the first rays of dawn. Siam modernized, but it remained Siam. The distinction felt important. Many societies feared modernization because they associated it with cultural loss. Yet Siam attempted something more difficult: modernization without surrendering identity, learning without imitation, adaptation without disappearance. The sky gradually brightened. Shades of purple became pink. Pink became gold. The city began waking around them. Boatmen prepared for the day. Market vendors arranged goods. Monks walked quietly through the streets, collecting alms. Life continued, as it always had, and yet, beneath that continuity, profound changes were taking place. Kun Prasert continued. King Chulalongkorn traveled extensively. Edward nodded. He remembered reading about that. The king had visited Europe, met foreign leaders, observed institutions firsthand, learned directly from the world around him. The storyteller smiled. That was unusual at the time. Many rulers rarely traveled far from their own capitals. Chulalongkorn understood the value of observation, seeing things personally, understanding how other nations operated, learning what worked, and perhaps equally important, learning what did not. Those journeys helped strengthen Siam's international position. Foreign governments increasingly viewed the kingdom differently. not as an isolated state trapped in the past, but as a nation actively participating in the modern world. Perceptions matter. The storyteller emphasized this. Countries are often judged not only by what they are, but by how others see them. Siam worked hard to shape those perceptions, and over time, the effort produced results. The 20th century arrived, a new era, a new world. The age of empire continued, but it was changing. New technologies emerged, new political ideas spread, global relationships evolved, and through it all, Siam remained independent, one of the very few nations in the region to do so. Edward stared across the river. The significance felt larger than ever. Many neighboring societies had experienced direct colonial rule. Their histories followed different paths. Their institutions developed under different circumstances. Their struggles for independence would come later, but Siam's experience was unique, not because it avoided all pressure, not because it escaped all loss, but because it preserved sovereignty, the ability to make its own decisions, the ability to determine its own future, even when those decisions were difficult, even when those choices carried costs. The storyteller's voice softened. Independence is often misunderstood. Edward listened carefully. Many people imagine it means complete freedom. The old man smiled sadly. But no nation lives completely free from pressure. The statement felt surprisingly modern, perhaps timeless. Throughout history, countries have always navigated external influences. Economic pressures, political pressures, military pressures. The challenge lies not in avoiding all influence. The challenge lies in maintaining the ability to choose, to govern oneself, to shape one's own destiny. And that, ultimately, was what Siam preserved. The sun rose slowly above the horizon. Golden light spilled across the river. The city transformed before their eyes. Darkness gave way to day, and somehow the moment felt symbolic. A fitting backdrop for the final lesson. The storyteller looked toward the sunlight, then back at Edward. Now tell me, the young traveler blinked. What? Kun Prasert smiled. You asked why Thailand was never colonized. Edward laughed softly. The question that had started everything. The question that no longer seemed simple. Not at all. He thought carefully before answering. It wasn't one reason. The storyteller nodded approvingly. Go on. Edward looked toward the river, gathering thoughts accumulated over many evenings. There was geography. Siam stood between rival empires. Good. There were wise kings. Kings who understood the changing world. Very good. There were reforms. Modernization. Education. Stronger institutions. The old man smiled. Excellent. There was diplomacy. Constant diplomacy. Negotiation. Patience. The storyteller nodded. And? Edward paused, then spoke quietly. Sacrifice. The word seemed to carry special weight. Siam gave up territory. It made painful compromises. It accepted losses to preserve independence. For a moment, only the river spoke. Then Kun Prasert smiled. You understand. The answer was not simple, because history is rarely simple. Thailand remained independent because many factors came together. Geography created opportunities. Leadership recognized them. Diplomacy used them. Modernization strengthened them. Sacrifice protected them. And yes, luck played a role too. History always contains an element of chance, but luck alone never explains decades of survival. Luck may open a door. People must still walk through it. The sun climbed higher. The city became fully awake. Boats moved across the river. Voices drifted through the air. The world continued. And yet, Edward felt changed. The question that brought him to Siam now seemed far richer than before, because the story was not really about avoiding colonization. Not entirely. It was about adaptation, wisdom, leadership, and the difficult choices nations sometimes face. The old storyteller rose slowly. The lesson had ended. The journey was complete. At least this journey. Before leaving, he looked once more toward the river. A river that had witnessed every chapter they discussed. The rise of kings, the arrival of foreign ships, the tension of crises, the hope of reforms, the survival of a nation. Then he turned back to Edward and spoke the final words of the story. People often ask why Thailand remained free. The old man smiled. But perhaps the better question is this. Edward waited. What kind of people were willing to do whatever was necessary to keep it free? The river shimmered beneath the morning sun. The city lived. The kingdom endured. And the answer, Edward realized, was found not in a single king, not in a single treaty, not in a single event, but in generations of people who understood that survival requires wisdom as much as courage, adaptation as much as strength, patience as much as determination. As you prepare to rest, imagine the Chao Phraya River flowing through centuries of history. Imagine lanterns drifting across dark water. Imagine kings studying maps beneath candlelight. Imagine diplomats negotiating through long nights. Imagine ordinary families hoping for peace. And imagine a small kingdom standing between empires, not untouched, not unchanged, but still standing, still sovereign, still itself. Because the story of Thailand's independence is not a story about avoiding history. It is a story about navigating history. And perhaps that is even more remarkable. Sleep peacefully. The river still flows. The stars still shine. And somewhere in the quiet distance, the story of Siam continues. Series conclusion. Why Thailand was never colonized was not the result of a single miracle or a single hero. It emerged from the combined efforts of visionary rulers, skilled diplomats, determined reformers, and countless ordinary people who helped their nation adapt to a changing world. Between powerful empires, Siam found a path that preserved its sovereignty and in doing so, created one of the most remarkable survival stories in modern history. Thailand still holds countless stories waiting to be discovered. If you would like to continue this journey together, I hope to see you again in the next story from Thailand Through Eyes. And if there is somewhere in Thailand you wish to visit through story, leave your suggestion below. Perhaps our next journey will begin there.